This is the 13th episode of Psych Survivalist, in which I will discuss some of the philosophical underpinnings of what became a soft science. I will also go into the process of observation, which may be very different from what you've previously seen discussed in the past. But before I do that, I would like to send greetings to those in various parts of the world that I recently learned were listening to this podcast. It's very hard to get good data on who's listening, but what I recently learned was that I have at least one listener in Ukraine, in Netherlands, in Germany, France, Spain, Brazil, Colombia, and Canada. If these discussions are interesting to you, I would like to have your thoughts and would welcome you back to listen again to future episodes. I call this the 13th episode, The Snake's Lecture, in which I give the limbic system voice to express what we can possibly learn from the experience of having a lizard brain. My foundational thesis is that most forms of mental health treatment and assessment are cognitively based, products of the cerebral cortex or gray matter. Little or no effort has been made scientifically to examine the contribution of the unconscious, what I call the lizard brain or snake, to our daily functioning. That is the limbic system, which is either light gray or white in color, the ignored contributor to overall cognitive functioning. Those parts of the brain, the lower parts, that also have input to our thought process. Most researchers think that it has no overt form of expression except through the cerebral cortex that is the basis of all expression, a belief that colors our understanding of thought, but that I posit is fundamentally incorrect. By way of introduction, I was going to start with a story about my stepson's martial arts training, an event that happened years ago, in which he came home and said suddenly that his sensei told him the importance of having humility. Now, he was a much younger man at the time, and it only took him 2 days to suddenly announce that he was humble. I'll say again that he has matured a lot since then, but the fact that he even made that assertion raised a question. That comes out of the fact that cognitively he can voice his intention to learn humility and even believe he has achieved it in 2 days, as he said, but he does not recognize that to have humility you must be humbled, something that is foiled by the belief that the simple assertion is sufficient to enact the change. Raising the question, do we learn from the acknowledgement and the assertion that what we want to believe is true, or do we need to have the experience of what we are claiming? That is our assertion sufficient, or do we need to be humbled before we can claim to have any humility? I'll add another example from my own past. When I was young, growing up with an older sociopathic brother, my only sib, who is now deceased. At a certain point many years ago, he decided that he was a genius just in the same way that our president asserts that he is one. But to support his argument, my brother had to simultaneously convince me that I was an idiot, someone to be toyed with. The only evidence I had to the contrary was what I had heard about our respective IQ tests, the results of which I had never actually seen. And I will add that there was more reason to believe his claim of high intelligence because he was getting around in the outside world a long time before I began to grasp and adapt to the rules of society and social intercourse, rules that he had long mastered frequently to the detriment of others, but that confounded me for the longest time. I did learn them, though, however slowly, and just that bit of learning changed the very rules I was operating in, and by association changed the rules for those around me. That is, when you change, others change around you, having to adapt to your new understanding and more adaptive level of functioning, whether they choose to recognize it or not. What do these varying experiences have to teach us about psychology and even about neuropsychology? First, I am offering both of these personal stories not as tales of the unusual, but of the typical, of stuff that occurs in most of our daily lives. But second, I had to dig through all those theories in psychology and neuropsychology that interested me over the years, theories that I had forgotten about and began to investigate on my own because some were not offered in my curriculum, but that I am resurrecting for this podcast because they influenced me and still do interest me, although in a very different way. The principle that I want to introduce here comes from Gestalt psychology, and I have to start by qualifying that this is not the same as Gestalt psychology that used to be current in the 1970s and 80s, a therapeutic model that was similar to psychodrama, and that it requires playing roles and is more a method of doing therapy rather than anything theoretical. But what I am focusing on here is primarily theory, not therapy. Specifically, the theory that I am referring to here is the idea of figure ground, where, to use Copilot's language, we distinguish a focal object as the figure from the background or its contextual environment. This distinction, as Copilot tells us, or should I say reminds us, since I knew this in the past, is that the individual perceiving the object, deciding perceptually what is figure and what is ground. The example offered is the image of the Rubin vase. If the border is assigned by the viewer as inward, a vase is seen, but if an outward border is perceived, it is recognized as two faces looking at each other. This is essentially a passive exercise that many of us have experienced. I use it here as a point of reference because I am about to turn this idea on its head, or expand on it anyway. Expand on it radically with the idea that this is not a static but a living experience that is the basis for providing us with information pertinent to our daily lives. Although I will pause for a minute to present how Copilot describes what cues a person uses to assign figure and ground. As it says, these cues are probabilistic, not absolute. Your brain weighs them together. A smaller region goes to figure, higher contrast goes to figure, more detail goes to figure, convex shapes go to figure, symmetrical regions go to figure, and enclosed regions go to figure. As it says, when the cues align, the figure pops out instantly. When cues conflict, perception becomes unstable. So what is salient to the eye that attracts our attention are smaller regions, higher contrast, more details, convex shapes, symmetrical regions, and enclosed regions. As these overlap to our eye, the more likely it is that we will assign figure to the importance of the object we are looking at. That is the alignment that is referred to here. It's when things are out of alignment, when cues conflict, that our perception becomes unstable. That is to say that more than one cue that is consistent in assigning importance to an image, including our perception of it, and the significance of what we are looking at, reinforce each other, leading to stable conclusions about the object we understand ourselves to perceive. This is no different than any other thought that we might have about people or ourselves. When perception and experience align with what we believe we know, we may draw stable conclusions, whether correct or incorrect, about self or others, but at least we have the security of consistency. What is implied is that everything that is not figure becomes part of the background, fading in our attention and in its significance to us as observers. Now to our head, the focus and the figure of it all. What I would like to introduce is the concept that this theory, and almost all other psychological theories and measures, are presenting these experiences as an observer, which is to say scientifically, as an object or person outside the observer that is to be observed, evaluated, and described as in the scientific method. An early example of the apple cart being upended is in quantum mechanics, where it was noticed that the mere measurement of a particle's actions affects outcome. From co-pilot, unobserved particles behave like waves, while observed particles behave like particles, a phenomenon that should tell us that there are no detached observations even in the hard sciences. If you are observing and measuring a particle, it is by definition a figure, just as we observe it, i.e., as a particle to us. But when we are not observing it, it is a wave, which meets the definition of a ground. It is the difference between being in and out of focus. I would argue that this is no different in psychology, where the person seeking help has their own insightful awareness about what is happening that affects them, usually negatively, while the treater-observer draws their own conclusions from what they are being told, based on how the treater's intellect or gray matter understands it, with a possible additional influence of the limbic that may be inarticulate. Given the imbalance in the relationship, the provider's opinion often supersedes that of the help seeker, whatever the cognitive influences may be in effect. The point is here that everyone is operating in the same figure-ground relationship, including therapist-client, but with an entirely different set of experiences that would support or not support any set of beliefs depending on the focus. Or as my mother wrote in 1962, Abel and Cain, Cain and Abel, sit beside me at the table. Which one's Cain and which one's Abel? That's the moral of the fable. Remembering, of course, that Cain slew his brother out of jealousy because, as the story goes, his offerings, indeed his person, was more pleasing to God. Cain identifying himself through his actions as a figure, while Abel was recognized by God, an expression that may be considered ground. Returning to a couple of figure grounds that were discussed earlier, humility and genius. Humility is the most obvious example of figure, as it raises the question, which part of our brain is initially humbled once we have set it as a goal in our perceptions? As I described, my stepson believed that he might achieve humility through a sheer act of will just by asserting its attainment. That is, through the efforts of the cerebral cortex, the gray matter, as having recognized it as a goal to be desired. And indeed, I did notice an increase in his humility after some bad judgments, some of which might have caused me to be humiliated had I taken such actions. But if this is the case, what part of our thinking is truly doing the learning for us, the cortex or the limbic system? I would argue that the part of the brain that is most attuned to the environment and is most subject to its influences is the lizard. The gray matter may understand and appreciate the lessons that is derived from experience, but it is the lizard or the ground that experiences. In this case, it undergoes the events that have impact on us, later to be intellectually interpreted for the experience's cognitive implications, interpreting the events to ascribe meaning and usefulness to the experience. As for genius, a quality that my deceased brother laid claim to while convincing me that I didn't have it. This assertion has more legs because no one knows what genius is anyway. It is believed to be associated with IQ, but formal IQ testing, such as the Weiss or Stanford-Binet, the best of the IQ tests, are brilliant for assessing individual cognitive functions, with each test including a number of challenging tasks, challenging cognitive tasks, most of which are unique measures that tap specific brain functions. This is especially true of the Stanford-Binet, among the earliest and the most rigorous of the IQ tests. But is it genius? a quality that awaits meaningful definition apart from a set of scores that are just numbers. Here I will introduce the notion that genius is best defined as the rendering of knowledge from real-world experience that first affects the lizard, but that is later interpreted by the cortex to render meaning from what has occurred. We get our best knowledge, in other words, by recognizing our involvement in the very events that we are trying to interpret as those events occur in our lives and vicariously through others. Our experiences have no utility until we attach meaning to them. I am thinking specifically of Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, as I believe he understood it. That is, the meaning a person derives from specific events, but that may not be fully understood by the person entering therapy. Events that interfere with an appreciation of self and subsequent action until the meaning is revealed to the subject so that it may be acted upon. But there is a caution that Copilot offers as applied to the economics of the limbic system. To quote Copilot on this topic, quote, "Every society runs on an economy. Some run on capital, some run on labor, some run on information, but the modern world runs on something older, something more primitive, something limbic. It runs on fear," close quote. Copilot continues from a strictly monetary point of view in a separate discussion. If you can trigger the limbic system reliably, you extract predictable revenue. That it refers specifically to money, and it lists areas of individual manipulation for the gain of the manipulator. These include dopamine anticipation loops, that is the possibility of winning money or goods. Fear-based engagement that includes outrage, fear of missing out, and threat cues. Comfort, nostalgia associations such as food entertainment or brand identity, and frictionless compulsive pathways such as one-click buying. And it concludes, quote, "These aren't marketing tactics, they're neuroeconomic levers," close quote. Which raises the question for me, questions for both mental health and the hard sciences. When you are not observing, when you are not simply reacting and measuring, what is your limbic system doing? I would suggest that that part of our brain is experiencing the events that provide us with the content of our lives. The lizard brain is existential by its very nature, in my opinion. It is here that Copilot and I part ways. That is, if the limbic responses remain insulated from the rest of our cognition and remain uninterpreted, all of our responses that follow are basic and feral. The raw responses when the limbic system has total sway, as pictured in the art that appears at the introduction to this episode, a monster movie of our own making. Experience is the ground. We are the figure making sense of our phenomenal world by interpreting and building on our experience, by trying to understand it. It is the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious, the observed and the unobserved, the particle and the wave. The great fear is that what we haven't seen or noticed may yet come to get us if we continue to separate ourselves from the world outside us and can't recognize our involvement in it. As for what this means in a practical sense, specifically for psychology and therapy, even for diagnosis, will affect the way that we practice or the way we experience therapy when we enter into it. We can choose to be passive observers as long as we choose to be, but to become active, it's necessary to take into account all of those things that we have experienced and perhaps not successfully processed to arrive at understanding. As you can see from the art that I've posted here, There is a sermon or a lecture that is being delivered to a crowd that is being beset by snakes, the horrors of the unconscious, of everything that people typically fear. But I would suggest that if we can integrate it as part of our experience as human beings, however frightful it may be, that we have the opportunity to learn from it, but more than that, to discover who we are as human beings or as souls. One can act or react, but it is all part of the same cognitive experience overall. If this is a subject that has been of interest to you, I would encourage you to respond. There is no part of this that I do not see as part of a larger discussion and open to anyone who wants to participate in it. And for those who are listening, be well, stay healthy, and for God's sake, don't go crazy.